In the vast, unforgiving silence of the Arizona territory, a woman's life could be measured in heartbeats. The beat of a coming storm, the beat of a horse's hooves, the beat of a soldier's fist on her door. For Ilara Vance, a widow living on the edge of nowhere, the silence was both a comfort and a curse. But on a night when the sky split open with rain and fury, that silence was broken by a sound that would change everything. It wasn't the law she was afraid of. It was the desperate plea in a man's eyes, a man the world called a savage. She was faced with a choice that night: listen to the world or listen to the frantic, terrified beat of her own heart. Her decision would turn her quiet ranch into a battleground and her lonely existence into a secret worth dying for. The wind came first, a low, mournful sigh across the chaparral that made the loose pane in the window of Ilara Vance's cabin rattle like a dying man's teeth. It was a lonely sound, one she had grown accustomed to in the year since her husband Thomas had been taken by the fever. The ranch, nestled in a shallow basin, miles from the nearest spit of a town called Redemption Bluff, was her entire world, a world of dust sun and profound silence. Tonight that silence was being murdered by the storm. The sky, a bruised purple and violent orange, promised a deluge. Ilara moved with an economy of motion, born from solitude, securing the shutters and bringing the last of the kindling inside. Her hands, though slender, were calloused and capable. She was 26, but the grief and the unforgiving sun had etched fine lines around her eyes, making her look older, warier. Just as the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the hard-packed earth, she heard it. It wasn't the wind or the approaching thunder. It was the frantic, panicked rhythm of a horse running itself into the ground. Peering through a crack in the shutter, she saw a silhouette against the darkening horizon. A single rider hunched low over his mount, pushing the animal with a desperate urgency that spoke of flight. He was coming straight for her ranch, not because it was a destination, but because it was the only thing standing between him and miles of open, unforgiving terrain. Her first instinct was fear. A lone rider racing a storm was almost certainly trouble. Bandits, outlaws, or worse. Her hand instinctively went to the cool, worn stock of the Winchester rifle resting above the hearth Thomas's rifle. But as the rider drew closer, the scene sharpened into a terrifying clarity. He wasn't a bandit. He was Apache. His long black hair was matted with rain and something darker. He rode bareback on a magnificent black stallion, a horse so sleek and powerful it seemed carved from midnight itself. The man swayed precariously, and Ilara could see the dark stain spreading across his deerskin leggings' blood. He was just yards from her barn when his strength finally gave out. He tumbled from the horse, a limp weight that hit the ground with a sickening thud. The stallion, a testament to its loyalty, skidded to a halt and stood over him, nickering low, its sides heaving. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. The stories from Redemption Bluff were a constant ugly whisper. Apache raids, scalped settlers, children stolen from their beds. Jebediah Smith, the owner of the general store, was the town's primary source of these tales, each one more gruesome than the last. Helping this man was madness. It was suicide. The army patrol led by the notoriously cruel Sergeant Elias Thorne swept through this territory every few weeks. They wouldn't ask questions. An Apache on her land, wounded no less, would be all the proof they needed to label her a sympathizer, a traitor. She should bar the door, douse the lamp, and pretend she'd seen nothing. But then she saw the man's face, upturned in the mud, as the rain began to fall in earnest. He was young, no older than she was. His features, though contorted in pain, were sharp and defined, not the monstrous caricature from Jebediah's stories. And in his eyes, As they flickered open for a brief second, she saw not malice, but a raw animal terror. It was the same terror she'd seen in a coyote caught in a trap, the same desperation she felt in her own heart every time she thought of her future, alone in this vast, empty land. God help me, she whispered the words, stolen by the wind. The decision broke over her like a fever. She grabbed a heavy oilcloth slicker and ran out into the maelstrom. The rain was a physical blow, cold and relentless. The black stallion shied away as she approached, its eyes wide and wild, but it didn't bolt. It seemed to understand. The Apache warrior was unconscious, his breathing shallow. The wound in his thigh was a deep gash, likely from a cavalry saber. It was bleeding sluggishly, the rain washing it clean in rivulets of pink. He was lighter than he looked, all lean muscle and bone. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Elara managed to drag him inch by agonizing inch toward the barn. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to pull her down with him. She heaved him over the threshold and onto a pile of clean hay in an empty stall, the scent of horse and damp earth filling the air. He groaned a low, guttural sound of pure agony. Then she turned her attention to the horse. It was the most beautiful creature she had ever seen, its coat like polished jet even under the lashing rain. It followed her into the barn without protest, its loyalty to its fallen rider absolute. Leading it into the adjacent stall, she quickly rubbed it down with a dry sack murmuring soft, soothing words. The animal was a giveaway. A horse like this would be noticed. It was a prize. Sergeant Thorne and his men would be hunting for it as much as they were for the man. Hiding the man was one thing. Hiding a horse of this caliber was another entirely. Working by the dim, flickering light of a single lantern, she stripped away the blood-soaked deerskin from the man's leg. The wound was deep and ugly. She was no doctor, but she'd tended to enough injured livestock, and to Thomas in his final days to know it needed to be cleaned and stitched if he was to have any chance. As she fetched the medical supplies, Thomas had insisted they keep carbolic acid needle and catgut. A terrifying thought struck her. The soldiers who did this would be tracking him. The storm would wash away his tracks for now, but they knew the direction he was heading, and her small isolated ranch was the only shelter for 20 miles. They would come. It wasn't a question of if, but when. She looked from the unconscious man, his life hanging by a thread in her hands, to the magnificent horse that was both his salvation and his damnation. She, Elara Vance, a woman who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, was now the keeper of a secret that the United States Army would kill to uncover. The storm outside raged, but inside the barn, a far more dangerous storm had just begun. The dawn broke grey and washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet sage and ozone. The storm had passed, leaving a world of glittering puddles and thick clinging mud in its wake. Inside the barn, the Apache warrior, whose name she did not know, was drifting in and out of a fevered consciousness. Elara had cleaned and stitched the wound as best she could, her hands shaking but her movements steady. She had forced some willow bark tea between his lips to fight the fever and wrapped his leg in clean linen bandages. Now all she could do was wait. The wait was short-lived. A little after sunrise, as she was boiling coffee on her small stove, a sound made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. The rhythmic, disciplined beat of multiple horses. Not the sound of a lone rider, but the confident, metallic jingle of a cavalry patrol. Her blood ran cold. Thorne. She raced to the window. 4 riders in Union blue were cresting the ridge, their figures stark against the pale morning sky. Leading them was Sergeant Elias Thorne, a man who sat his horse like a tyrant on a throne. He was a thick, bull-necked man with a florid face and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold empty and missing nothing. He believed the only good Apache was a dead one, and he pursued this belief with a religious fervor that unsettled even the most hardened soldiers. Ilara's mind worked with frantic speed. The man was in the barn, hidden in the farthest stall behind a stack of hay bales. The horse was the real problem. It was too distinctive, too noble. She had tucked it into the stall beside its master, hoping the shadows and the clutter of the barn would conceal it. It was a fool's hope. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the apron over her simple dress, and schooled her features into a mask of weary neutrality. She had to meet them outside. Letting them inside the cabin was not an option. She stepped onto the porch just as they reined in the horses, churning the wet ground into a soupy mess. Sergeant Thorne said his voice, a gravelly rumble that was meant to be polite but carried an undercurrent of pure menace. He didn't dismount. He looked down on her, his gaze sweeping over her small cabin, the barn, the corral. Assessing. Hunting. Sergeant Ilara replied, her voice commendably even. What brings the army out to my humble piece of land so early? Official business Mrs. Vance Thorne said, his eyes lingering on her face. We're tracking a fugitive, an Apache renegade. Cut down 2 of my men in a skirmish yesterday near the San Pedro. We wounded him, but he got away. His gaze flicked pointedly to the barn. On a very specific horse, a big black stallion. Mean as the devil himself. You haven't seen anything like that, have you? Every word was a stone dropped into the pit of her stomach. A black stallion, Ilara feigned a thoughtful frown. Can't say that I have. The storm was fierce last night. I didn't see much of anything except lightning. Thorne's lips thinned into a semblance of a smile. It didn't reach his eyes. A woman all alone out here. Must be frightening. A renegade on the loose. He's wounded, Mom. He'd be looking for shelter. A place like this. He let the sentence hang in the air, thick with insinuation. Behind him, a younger soldier. Corporal Miller shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He was a fresh-faced boy from Ohio, with kind eyes that seemed out of place under the brim of his campaign hat. He wouldn't meet her gaze. I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself, Sergeant Ilara said, her tone hardening, just enough to signal she wouldn't be intimidated. My husband Thomas taught me how to use a rifle. Thorne's smile widened slightly. I'm sure he did. Still, a search of your property is in order. For your own safety, of course. A search, Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. You have a warrant for that? Thorne chuckled a dry, humorless sound. Mom out here. My orders are the warrant. We're not in Boston. The safety of settlers from savages takes precedence over paperwork. He swung himself down from his horse, his boots sinking into the mud with an authoritative squelch. The other soldiers dismounted their movements, disciplined and menacing. Stay here with the Lady Thorne, ordered Corporal Miller before turning to the other 2. Check the corral, the shed. I'll take the barn. The barn! Ilara's mind raced. She had to do something, create a diversion. As Thorne strode toward the barn doors, she called out, her voice sharp. Sergeant, a word of caution. He stopped, turning back with an expression of mild annoyance. My mare is in there, she said, lying smoothly. She foaled 2 weeks ago. She's fiercely protective. If you go stomping in there, she's liable to kick your head clean off your shoulders. She doesn't take kindly to strangers. Thorne's eyes narrowed, searching her face for any sign of deception. For a tense moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from within the barn came the soft, low nicker of a horse. Thorne's head snapped toward the sound. A triumphant, predatory gleam entered his eyes. Sounds like she's got company. He ignored her warning, and shoved the heavy barn doors open. Sunlight streamed into the dusty interior, illuminating motes of hay that danced in the air. Ilara's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her ears. This was it. It was over. Thorne stepped inside his boots, echoing on the wooden floorboards. He walked past the stall where Ilara kept her own placid brown mare and her new foal. The mare snorted nervously at the intrusion. Thorne paid them no mind. His eyes were fixed on the back of the barn, on the shadows where she'd hidden her secret. He moved towards the far stall. Ilara watched, frozen from the doorway. She could see the edge of the hay bales she'd stacked. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Thorne reached the stall. He paused, savoring the moment of discovery. He kicked aside a loose bale of hay, and then he stopped. A look of confusion, quickly replaced by raw anger, crossed his face. He kicked another bale. Nothing. He spun around his face, a mask of fury, and stormed back towards her. "What kind of game are you playing, woman?" Ilara's mind, which had gone blank with terror, struggled to catch up. How was this possible? He should have seen them. "I told you she was protective," Ilara said, her voice a weak whisper. Thorne pushed past her, his shoulder slamming into hers, and remounted his horse. "This isn't over, Mrs. Vance. We found his trail leading into this basin. The storm washed it out. But he's here. Somewhere. And when I find him, I'll find whoever helped him." He glared at her, his eyes promising retribution. "And I will show them no mercy." He spurred his horse, and the patrol galloped away, leaving Ilara trembling in the churned mud of her yard. She waited until they were a distant speck before she sagged against the doorframe, her legs refusing to hold her. After a moment, she gathered her strength and stumbled back into the barn. She went to the far stall, her mind reeling. She pushed aside the hay bales. The stall was empty. Panic seized her. Had he woken up and run impossible in his condition? Then she saw it. In the rear wall of the stall, a section of wooden planks was swung slightly inward. It was a section Thomas had cleverly hinged from the top years ago to create a small secondary exit into the dense thicket of mesquite that grew right up against the back of the barn. It was a bolt hole, one he'd built in case of a fire, a secret exit she had completely forgotten. She pushed through it and found herself in the thicket, and there, not 10 feet away, stood the black stallion, as silent as a wraith. Lying on the ground beside it, propped against a rock and covered by a thick canvas tarp, was the Apache warrior. He was awake, his dark eyes lucid and fixed on her. In his hand, he held a knife. He had heard Thorne. He had dragged himself and his horse out through the passage, ready to fight or die, rather than be found in her barn. He had saved them both. As their eyes met, a silent, profound understanding passed between them. She was no longer just his reluctant savior. He was now her protector, too, and they were bound together by a secret that had just grown infinitely more dangerous. In the tense days that followed, the barn became a sanctuary and a prison. The Apache warrior who eventually offered her his name, Cale, remained hidden in the thicket behind the secret door, returning to the relative comfort of the hay-filled stall only at night. His fever broke on the second day, a testament to a constitution forged by a life of hardship. Ilara, moving like a ghost on her own land, brought him water food and fresh bandages, her ears constantly strained for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Communication was a bridge built of gestures and single carefully chosen words. Her English, and what little Spanish she knew, was met by his sparse, gutacular Apache, and a handful of Spanish words he'd picked up. Yet they began to understand one another. She learned that the gash on his leg was from a soldier's saber during an ambush that had scattered his small band, He was trying to reach his people, his family, who were making for the traditional winter grounds in the Dragoon Mountains, a journey of over 100 miles. He learned her name Ilara, and spoke it with a quiet reverence that made her feel seen for the first time in a year. He saw the grief that still clung to her like a shroud, and the fierce independence that had grown in its place. One afternoon, as she was changing the bandage on his leg, their hands brushed. The contact sent a jolt through her, a startling warmth that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with a long-dormant human connection. She pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing. Kyle's expression didn't change, but his dark, intense eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. He was a man of profound stillness. He would sit for hours watching the play of light and shadow, his senses attuned to the world in a way she couldn't comprehend. He taught her to distinguish the call of a hawk from that of an eagle, to read the subtle signs of a passing coyote in the dust. He was a part of this land, while she was merely a resident upon it. The fear that had initially governed her actions began to recede, replaced by a grudging respect, and then a cautious affection. She saw the man, not the savage of Thorne's propaganda. She saw the worry in his eyes when he spoke of his family and the quiet dignity with which he bore his pain. One evening he was working on a small piece of cottonwood with his knife. She watched him from the stall door, the lantern light casting long dancing shadows. His hand, strong and sure, moved with an artist's precision. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a small, intricately carved bird, a tiny wren, perfect in every detail. "For you," he said, one of the few English phrases he used. Ilara took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, delicate lines. It was a simple gift, yet it felt more precious than gold. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you, a recognition of the bond that was forming between them in the silence and the shadows. It was the first gift she had received since Thomas had passed. A lump formed in her throat. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you, Kyle." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, but a softness entered his eyes that spoke volumes. In that shared moment, the dynamic between them shifted. The patient and the nurse, the fugitive and the harborer, those roles fell away, leaving just a man and a woman, isolated from the world, finding a fragile solace in each other's company. The black stallion, whom Kyle called Shade, was a constant, powerful presence. The horse was devoted to his master. During the day, Ilara would let him graze in a small, hidden canyon at the far end of her property, a place Thomas had called the Pocket. It was screened from view by a thick stand of juniper and rock formations. Bringing him there and back under the cover of twilight was a risk, but the magnificent animal needed to stretch its legs. Kyle's face would light up with a rare, open smile whenever he saw his horse, the bond between them a tangible thing. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. Her supplies were running low. She needed flour salt, and more importantly, more laudanum for the pain in Kyle's leg and fresh linen for bandages. She had been putting off the trip to Redemption Bluff, but she could wait no longer. "I have to go to town," she told Kyle one morning, using a mix of words and gestures. He understood immediately. His face grew taut with worry. "Soldiers," he said the word, a harsh stone in his mouth. "I have to," she insisted. "I'll be careful." He reached out and for the first time touched her arm. His grip was firm, urgent. He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze conveying a warning more potent than any words. He knew as she did that going into town was like walking into the lion's den. Sergeant Thorne would be there, and he would be watching. The wagon ride to Redemption Bluff felt longer than usual, every creak of the wheels and snort of her old draft horse amplifying Ilara's anxiety. The town was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a smithy and the sheriff's office. It was a place where secrets had a shorter lifespan than a puddle in July. She tied the wagon in front of Smith's general store, the bell above the door, announcing her arrival with a cheerful, dissonant jingle. The store's owner, Jebediah Smith, a man whose body was as round as his worldview was narrow, looked up from behind the counter. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his smile a little too wide. "Been a while. We were starting to think that storm washed you away." "I'm more resilient than I look," Jebediah Ilara replied, coolly handing him her list. As he gathered her items, flour beans, coffee, he leaned in conspiratorially. "You'll want to be careful on your way back. The whole territory's on edge. Sergeant Thorne was in here just yesterday, buying up all my 4570 cartridges. Said he's closing the net on that Apache devil who killed his men." Ilara focused on inspecting a bolt of calico, keeping her face impassive. "Is that so?" "Yes, indeed," Jebediah warmed to his topic, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "He's a cold one, that Thorne. Says the savage is wounded and hiding out somewhere in the basins. Says he's got a helper, too. Can you imagine some white folk turning traitor on their own kind for one of them heathens?" He shook his head, his jowls quivering with self-righteous indignation. "Thorne says when he finds them, he'll make an example of them both. A public example." Ilara's blood turned to ice. A public example. A hanging. She paid for her goods, her hand steady, despite the tremor that ran through her. She added a bottle of laudanum and a roll of linen to her basket. "Someone fall ill?" Jebediah asked, his beady eyes lingering on the medical supplies. "My mare kicked me." Ilara lied without skipping a beat. "Nasty bruise on my leg. Needs wrapping." He seemed to accept the explanation, but not before filing the information away behind his prying eyes. As Ilara left the store, she felt his gaze on her back heavy and suspicious. Her next stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a different sort of man from Thorne. He was older with a weathered face and a quiet authority that came from experience, not intimidation. He was the law in Redemption Bluff, and he had a deep-seated dislike for the Army's habit of acting like an occupying force. He had respected Thomas and had offered Ilara his condolences with a sincerity that was rare in this hard country. He was sitting at his desk, cleaning his Colt Peacemaker. He looked up as she entered. "Ilara," he said, his voice a welcome balm after Jebediah's grating tones. "Good to see you. Everything all right out at your place?" "As right as it can be, Sheriff," she said, trying for a casual tone. "Just picking up supplies." He finished reassembling the pistol with practiced ease, his eyes never leaving her face. He saw more than most. "I saw Thorne's patrol pass through. They seemed mighty interested in the land around your basin." He paused. "He's a man with a dangerous obsession, Ilara. He's not just hunting an Apache. He's hunting a ghost he can blame for all his own failures. You be careful. Don't get caught in his crossfire." It was a warning, plain and simple. He suspected something, or perhaps he was just a decent man looking out for a widow. Either way, his words chilled her to the bone. As she loaded her supplies into the wagon, she saw him, Sergeant Thorne. He was standing across the street, leaning against a post outside the saloon, watching her. He wasn't trying to hide it. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand, and his eyes were fixed on her wagon, specifically on the basket, with the linen and laudanum peeking out. A slow, cruel smile touched his lips. He lifted his glass in a mock toast. He knew. He didn't have proof, but in his mind, he knew. He was toying with her, letting her see the noose he was slowly, meticulously weaving for her and the man she was protecting. The ride home was a blur of controlled panic. Every rock and cactus seemed to hold the shape of a watching soldier. She had walked into the lion's den, and the lion had looked her right in the eye. She was no longer just a person of interest. She was a target. The secret she was keeping was no longer a quiet act of defiance. It was a declaration of war. When she finally arrived back at the ranch, the sight of the familiar cabin brought no relief, only a heightened sense of dread. She found Kyle waiting near the hidden entrance, his posture rigid with tension. He had seen the look on her face. Town was a mistake, she said, her voice trembling slightly as she unloaded the supplies. He took the basket from her, his eyes falling on the bandages. He looked from them to her, and then to the horizon, in the direction of Redemption Bluff. He understood completely. That night, as she sat at her small table, the carved wooden bird in her hand, she knew a turning point had been reached. She had gone to town for supplies to save a life, and in doing so she may have just doomed them both. The whispers in Redemption Bluff were about to become a roar, and it was rolling directly toward them. Thorne was a patient predator. He didn't ride out to the ranch again. Instead, he made his presence a suffocating, invisible force. The patrols increased their routes, tightening like a noose around Ilara's property. She would see them on the ridges at dawn, their silhouettes black against the rising sun. She would hear the distant echo of a bugle call on the wind. They were cutting her off, turning her sanctuary into a cage. Cale grew more restless each day. The confinement was antithetical to his very being. His leg was healing the deep muscle wound, slowly knitting together, but his spirit was fraying. He would stand for hours at the edge of the thicket, staring out at the distant mountains. His destination, his family, his freedom. "I must go," he told her one evening, his voice tight with frustration. He now had a limp, but he was strong enough to ride. "I bring this danger to you. You won't make it a mile." Ilara argued her own fear, making her sharp. "They are everywhere, Kyle. They are waiting for you. It's a trap. To stay is a trap." He countered, his dark eyes flashing. "For you." The argument was left unresolved, a bitter tension hanging between them. They were caught in an impossible situation. To stay was to wait for certain discovery, but to leave was to ride into certain death. A few nights later, a new kind of fear arrived. It came in the form of a single rider approaching not from the main track but cautiously through the scrubland. Ilara's hand flew to the Winchester, her heart seizing, but as the rider drew into the moonlight, she recognized him. It was Corporal Miller, the young soldier with the conflicted eyes. He reined in his horse, a safe distance from the cabin, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "Mrs. Vance," he called out, his voice low and urgent. "I'm not here with the sergeant." Wary Ilara stepped onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at her side. "What do you want?" Corporal Miller dismounted, his movements furtive. He looked exhausted, the boyishness gone from his face, replaced by a deep, troubled weariness. I had to warn you," he stammered, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "You have to know what you're dealing with." Thorne. He's not right in the head about this. He took a shaky breath. "Yesterday we captured a young Apache boy, no more than 15. He was just hunting rabbits." Thorne. He questioned him about the warrior and the black horse. The boy didn't know anything. He kept saying he didn't know. Miller's voice dropped to a choked whisper. Thorne didn't believe him. He used his saber, Mom. He said he was making an example. The other men, we just stood there. We just watched. He finally looked up at her, his eyes swimming with shame and horror. He doesn't want a prisoner, Mrs. Vance. He isn't trying to arrest anyone. He wants a scalp. He talks about it at night. He says he wants to bring the Apache's head back to the fort, and the head of whoever is helping him. The corporal's words hung in the cold night air, an obscene testament to the madness that was hunting them. This was no longer about military justice. It was a personal, bloodthirsty vendetta. "Why are you telling me this?" Elara asked, her voice barely audible. "Because my father raised me to believe that a soldier's uniform doesn't give a man the right to be a monster." Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever is going on here, Mum, no one deserves what he has planned." He backed away toward his horse. "He's planning to come back. Soon. He's just waiting for a pretext, any little piece of proof. Be careful." With that, he mounted his horse and melted back into the night, leaving Elara with a truth more terrifying than any suspicion. She turned and went straight to the barn. Kyle had heard everything. He was standing in the shadows, his face a mask of cold fury and profound sorrow. He had known the depths of Thorne's cruelty, but hearing it confirmed, hearing of the fate of a boy from a neighboring clan, extinguished the last flicker of hope in his eyes. "It is time," Tale said, his voice devoid of all emotion. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement of fact. This time Elara didn't argue. Corporal Miller's warning had changed everything. They could no longer afford to be passive victims waiting for the axe to fall. They had to act. Tomorrow night, she said, her own voice taking on a hard, resolute edge. "There's a sliver of moon. The patrols are lightest in the hours before dawn. There's a dry wash that runs north toward the foothills. It should hide your tracks for a few miles. It will be your best chance." He nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered. They had one day to prepare for a desperate flight that would either lead to freedom or a brutal, violent end. The secret they had guarded was about to be carried out into the open, and the consequences would be written in blood. The next day was a lifetime compressed into hours. A heavy, expectant silence hung over the ranch, thick with unspoken farewells and a gnawing dread. Elara packed a small canvas bag for Kyle, smoked jerky a canteen of water, the last of the linen bandages, and the small bottle of laudanum. Every item she packed felt like a prayer. Kyle spent the day with Shade, murmuring to the stallion in the low, guttural tones of his language, stroking its powerful neck. He was preparing his only companion for the grueling journey ahead. He also took time to sharpen his knife on a whetstone until the edge was a razor-thin line of glittering steel. He was no longer a patient, but a warrior preparing for battle. They barely spoke. The intimacy they had built in the quiet moments was now overshadowed by the looming violence. A chasm was opening between their worlds, ready to swallow them both. Late in the afternoon, as Elara was scanning the horizon for the 100th time, she saw a flicker of movement near the arroyo where she'd once found a piece of turquoise. She squinted, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm. It was a soldier on foot, moving in a low crouch. Thorne hadn't been waiting for proof. He'd been creating it. He must have planted something, or he was looking for any small sign they might have overlooked. She ran to the barn. "They're here," she breathed, her voice tight with panic. "A scout in the arroyo." Kyle's face became grim stone. The time for a stealthy escape was gone. They had been found. He grabbed his knife. "You must go," he said, his voice a low command. "To the house. Bar the door. This is my fight." "No," Elara said, the word coming out with a ferocity that surprised them both. She grabbed the Winchester from its pegs on the wall. This started on my land. It ends on my land. This is my fight too. His eyes searched hers, and in them he saw not a frightened woman, but a protector as fierce and unyielding as any warrior from his own tribe. He gave a single sharp nod. The secret was no longer something she was hiding. It was something she was prepared to defend. The sun began its slow, bloody descent, painting the clouds in shades of crimson and violet. The scout must have reported back because soon they heard it, the unmistakable sound of Thorne's patrol riding hard and fast, making no attempt at stealth. This was not a search, this was an assault. As the hoofbeats grew louder, another sound joined them coming from the direction of town. A single rider pushing his horse at a steady, determined pace. Through the twilight, Ilara recognized the broad-shouldered silhouette of Sheriff Brody. He must have seen Thorne's patrol riding out armed for war, and decided that military business had finally trespassed too far onto his territory. He was riding into the storm just as Cale had. Thorne and his 3 men, Corporal Miller among them, his face pale and set, thundered into the yard surrounding the barn. Ilara Vance Thorne bellowed, his voice raw with triumph. "It's over. We found this by your fence line." He held up a small object. It was the intricately carved wren Kyle had given her. It must have dropped from her apron pocket. It was the proof he needed. "Send out the savage, or we'll burn this barn to the ground with him in it." The heavy barn door creaked open. But it wasn't Cale who stepped out. It was Ilara holding the Winchester rifle its barrel level and pointed directly at Sergeant Thorne's chest. "Get off my land, Sergeant," she said, her voice ringing with cold, clear authority. "You have no jurisdiction here." Thorne laughed, a genuinely surprised and ugly sound. "You'd choose him over your own kind. You're a fool, woman." He raised his own rifle. "That's a choice you're going to regret." Just as he leveled his weapon, a new voice cut through the tension. "I'd think twice about that, Sergeant." Sheriff Brody rode into the yard, reining in his horse, to place himself between Thorne and Ilara. He had his Colt drawn, held loosely, but ready. "Last I checked, threatening an unarmed citizen on her own property is a crime in this county. Now you and your men can turn around and ride out, or you can explain your actions to a federal judge." A tense 3-way standoff settled over the yard, thick and heavy as dust. Thorne's face was purple with rage, his authority challenged by a woman and a small-town sheriff. Ilara stood her ground, her knuckles white on the rifle stock. And inside the barn, Cale waited, a silent predator, ready to strike. The secret was out in the open now, and the setting sun was casting long shadows that looked remarkably like graves. "This is army business," Brody Thorne snarled, his voice a low growl that vibrated with barely contained violence. His florid face darkened, the veins standing out on his thick neck. "You have no authority here." "This woman," he spat the word, gesturing with his rifle barrel toward Ilara, "is harboring a murderer, a renegade, who killed 2 of my men. She is an accomplice, a traitor. Now for the last time, step aside." Sheriff Brody didn't so much as flinch. He sat his horse like a granite monument, a calm island in a sea of rage. "I see a widow on her own property being menaced by an armed squad led by a man who seems to have forgotten his oath," Brody retorted, his voice dangerously quiet, but carrying across the yard with absolute clarity. "My authority begins where a citizen of this county is threatened. Last I checked, that authority extends right up to the barrel of your rifle. You and your men can turn around and ride out, or you can prepare to explain your actions to a federal judge. The choice is yours, Sergeant." Ilara stood frozen in the terrible space between them, the weight of the Winchester a cold, heavy reality in her hands. Her fear was a living thing coiling in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a strange, fierce calm. She kept her eyes fixed on Thorne's, seeing not a soldier, but a rabid dog cornered and ready to lash out at anything that moved. She knew he was beyond reason. This would not end with words. For a heart-stopping moment, Thorne's knuckles whitened on his rifle. He was actually considering it, firing on a duly appointed lawman. The air grew thick and still, charged with the promise of bloodshed. The only sounds were the anxious stamping of the horses and the wind whispering through the eaves of the barn. And then the heavy barn door behind Elara creaked open wider. Kyle stepped into the fading light. He was no longer a hidden invalid, but a warrior in his element. He held only his knife, its polished steel, catching the last blood-red rays of the sun. He didn't limp. He moved with a fluid, deliberate grace, placing himself slightly in front of, and to the side of Elara, a silent, living shield. His face was a mask of grim resolve, his dark eyes sweeping over the soldiers, assessing them, not as a group, but as individuals. He saw the shock, the anger, and on Corporal Miller's face, the profound conflict. His appearance was a calculated risk, a strategic move to draw the storm to himself, to pull the lightning from the sky before it struck the woman who had saved him. It worked perfectly. Thorne's focus, which had been divided between Elara and Brody, snapped onto Cale with magnetic intensity. The sergeant's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated triumph. "There you are, you devil!" he roared, his voice cracking with glee. "Your time has come." He swung his rifle, the motion swift and brutal. But in that instant, Corporal Miller, positioned to Thorne's right, made his choice. The memory of the tortured Apache boy, the sergeant's cruel laughter, Elara's terrified but defiant face, it all coalesced into a single desperate act of conscience. As Thorne took aim, Miller gave a sharp, almost imperceptible tug on his reins. His horse startled, shifted its weight, bumping hard against Thorne's mount. The jolt was just enough. Thorne's rifle roared the sound, a physical blow that echoed off the hills. The shot went wide, splintering the wooden frame of the barn door, inches from where Cale had been standing. Thorne let out a bellow of pure rage, his plan for a clean, triumphant kill spoiled. His madness, simmering for days, now boiled over. He was humiliated, thwarted by a woman, a small-town sheriff, and now his own men's incompetence. His wild, hate-filled eyes darted around and found the source of it all. It wasn't the Apache. It was her, the woman. She had started this. She would end it. His logic shattered, replaced by a singular burning need for retribution. "You!" he screamed, the word tearing from his throat. He swiveled his rifle, swinging the heavy barrel away from Cale, away from Brody, and leveled it directly at Elara's heart. Time seemed to warp and stretch. Elara saw the dark, round opening of the muzzle, an abyss ready to swallow her. She saw the madness in Thorne's eyes, the final, irrevocable decision. The world narrowed to that single point of terror. She was too slow, too frozen to react. But Kyle was not. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man so recently wounded. He didn't have time to use his knife, only to act to protect, to repay the debt. With a guttural cry, he threw himself sideways, a blur of motion, slamming his body into hers. The impact was violent, knocking the breath from her lungs and sending them both tumbling to the ground, behind the dubious cover of an old half-full water trough. As they fell, Thorne's rifle roared a second time. The sound was different, followed by a sickening wet thud. Instead of the splintering of wood, there was the impact of lead on flesh. Kyle cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pure agony that was cut short as he collapsed beside her. The bullet meant for Elara had torn through his upper shoulder, a devastating wound at close range. The sight of a uniformed U.S. Army sergeant firing deliberately on an unarmed white woman, a shot that had instead struck the man who threw himself in her path, shattered the scene. It was a line that could not be crossed, a taboo, so profound it broke the spell of military discipline. The other two soldiers stared, their faces masks of pale, slack-jawed disbelief. This wasn't a battle. It was a crime. Sheriff Brody's voice cut through the ringing in Ilara's ears, sharp and cold as a razor. "Elias Thorne, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of a civilian." He bellowed, his own pistol, now aimed with deadly intent at the sergeant's head. This was the final catalyst for Corporal Miller. His loyalty to the uniform, already stretched to its breaking point, snapped. As Thorne, wild-eyed and fumbling to reload for another shot, cycled the rifle's lever, Miller spurred his horse forward. He didn't hesitate. With a powerful two-handed swing, he slammed the butt of his own rifle against his sergeant's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. Thorne's rifle clattered into the mud. "It's over," Sir Miller said, his voice shaking with adrenaline and revulsion. The other two soldiers jolted into action, shared a quick, decisive glance. They slowly lowered their own weapons, their allegiance shifting in that instant from their unhinged commander to the lawman who represented order. It was a silent, bloodless mutiny. Thorne looked around his face, a canvas of stunned incomprehension. He was surrounded. His men, his authority, his entire world had evaporated in the space of 2 gunshots. His eyes, burning with a feverish, impotent hatred, settled on Ilara as she desperately tried to staunch the bright, pulsing flow of blood from Cale's new wound. He was beaten. Brody dismounted his gun, never wavering. "Corporal," he commanded, his voice now calm and utterly in control. "Disarm him completely." Miller, his face grim, pulled the revolver from Thorne's holster. The fight was over. The yard fell into a sudden, profound quiet, broken only by the ragged, pained sound of Cale's breathing and the soft nickering of the horses. Ilara looked up from Cale, his hot blood slick on her hands, and met Sheriff Brody's gaze. Her secret was no longer a secret, but the truth of it, the courage, the sacrifice, the unexpected humanity was etched into the violent tableau in her yard for all to see. She had hidden the Apache's horse from the soldiers, and in doing so had become the center of a storm. But as she looked at Kyle, who had taken a bullet for her, and at Corporal Miller and Sheriff Brody, who had stood against their own to defend what was right, she realized she was no longer just a secret keeper. She was a secret they had all in their own way, just risked everything to protect. In the quiet aftermath, as the dust settled in the twilight of Ilara Vance's yard, a new kind of justice had been forged, one not written in law books, but in acts of courage and conscience. Sergeant Thorne was taken away in disgrace, his career ending not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet click of Sheriff Brody's handcuffs. Kyle, tended to by a visiting doctor Brody summoned, would eventually heal his second scar, a permanent reminder of the woman who risked everything for a stranger. Their farewell was one of profound, unspoken words, a shared glance that acknowledged a bond too deep for their separate worlds to contain. As Ilara watched him and the magnificent black stallion disappear toward the Dragoon Mountains, she knew her life of quiet solitude was over. She had faced down the very worst of men and discovered the very best in others and in herself. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism don't happen on a battlefield, but in the quiet corners of the world, in a single defiant choice to protect another human being. It's a testament to the fact that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. What did you think of Ilara's choice? What would you have done in her position? Let me know in the comments below. If this story of unlikely allies and unshakable courage moved you, Please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a powerful tale from the Old West. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that bring history to life. Thanks for listening.